Good morning everyone, and welcome to the video tute relating to our Christianity in-depth study with a focus on the content area of ethics. This particular video tute will be focusing on bioethics within the ethic content area, with particular focus on the issues of abortion and euthanasia. Now, in the previous video, I considered these bioethical issues in relation to the Christian perspective. This video will recap a couple of those ideas, but will focus more so on the variants of Catholic, Anglican and Uniting Church and how their views are similar and or different when responding to the issues of abortion and euthanasia. So hopefully, as you're aware by now, your syllabus dot point asks you to be able to describe and explain Christian ethical teachings on bioethics. So describe is to provide characteristics and features. There's no V in features. Explain is to relate cause and effect, make relationships between things evident. All right. Provide why and or how. Okay. Now, so you need to provide characteristics and features of Christian ethical teachings, and you need to explain how these ethical teachings can be related to particular issues. Now, the ethical teachings that we are going to focus on include the 10 Commandments, the Beatitudes, and Jesus' commandments of love. Okay? And then in terms of bioethics, as you are aware, we're looking at abortion and euthanasia. All right, so essentially you need to be able to recognise the Christian ethical teachings that provide guidance and then look at how they provide guidance for an individual when dealing with particular situations, in this case abortion and euthanasia. So before we begin, we'll just recap the definition of abortion, which is the bringing about a premature ending to the process of fetal development by aborting the unborn from the womb. All right, so essentially that's killing an unborn baby, either as an embryo or a fetus. Now, in the last video, we learnt that Christianity as a whole does not promote abortion in any way. In terms of the variants of Catholic, Anglican and Uniting Church, we can see that each of these, obviously as a member of Christianity, do not promote abortion. Catholics, firstly, say no to abortion, no exceptions to the rule. Anglicans also say no to abortion, but there are some exceptions. Uniting Church, again, they do not promote abortion. However, they don't have an official stance on the matter. All right, they tend to focus on mercy and compassion. Sorry, I can't seem to spell compassion. In terms of euthanasia, you're looking at the termination of life pretty much to end suffering. Now, euthanasia can be requested by a person who is dying and they want to end their life. They may also use assistance from others and predominantly use any types of drugs or chemicals to bring about this death. There are two types of euthanasia, active and passive. Passive is when the person willfully chooses to end their own life, predominantly through lethal injections. Whereas passive is the withdrawal of medication that is keeping them alive in order to allow the natural process of death to occur. In a lot of ways, euthanasia, as far as an ethical decision, seems quite black and white. Right? In ending a life, a Christian is directly violating the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Now, given that euthanasia is about ending life, the ethical decision is not simply who has the right to say when I die, but looks more to when a human being is no longer actually living, but rather simply surviving. Right? So there's questions about the quality of life in there. Now, in saying that, we're looking at the perspective that Christians recognise that human life is a gift from God, and that's up to Him to decide. So as far as common ground goes, we're again just taking in the Christian perspective as a whole, we've got the commandment, thou shalt not kill, which pretty much sets up euthanasia to be a no across the board for Christians. All right. However, you could also apply the quote that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. And it's referring to the idea that God loved humanity so much that He gave life to them. Therefore, He is the only one who is capable of taking it. All right. These two quotes present the Christian perspective as being a no to euthanasia. But as we've learnt from our study of abortion, there are variations in terms of the denominations and the way they interpret these ethical teachings. All right, so to give you a quick summary, from the Catholic perspective, we have a no to euthanasia, no exceptions. Anglican, very similar to Catholics in the fact that they say no as well, with no exceptions. And the Uniting Church, in a similar way to their view on abortion, they don't have an official stance and they take in the context or situation. Again, they show a focus on mercy. Okay, so now that we've introduced abortion and euthanasia and just have a feel for the viewpoints of the varying denominations, we're now going to go into a little bit more detail. So we're going to start off with the Roman Catholic view of abortion. Now, they are completely and utterly opposed to abortion. Right? They believe that any involvement in abortion is considered a mortal sin, right? Which is any sin that is committed with full knowledge that it is wrong. Right? If forgiveness is not sought, then they will be eternally separated from God, which we know for Catholics is not ideal. All right? They want to spend the afterlife with God. Now, a quote that you can pretty much sums up this perspective is a person who actually procures an abortion incurs automatic excommunication. Right? And that's from the Code of Canon Law dated 1983. So this essentially is looking at the fact that from a Catholic perspective, the Catholic Church becomes a community for a particular individual, right? It's their faith. It is their support system in a lot of ways. So to be excommunicated from them and not be allowed to go to the church would be quite difficult and upsetting, right? So this excommunication is designed to encourage those not to have an abortion. So before we go any further, I think it's important just to clarify that from this perspective, you're looking at the idea that any type of sexual activity is engaged in purely within the bounds of marriage, okay? And that within that, sexual acts are undertaken in order to conceive a child, all right, to create life. So if we're looking at it from that perspective, then hopefully you can understand why there is this view of no abortions. All right, now, continuing on from that, we're looking at one of the main reasons why Catholics are so against abortion is that they believe that life begins at conception, okay? So from that moment, not a couple of weeks down the track, from the moment of conception. Now, they believe that if a woman is to engage in abortion, it can have quite serious physical but also emotional and mental side effects for the women who have them. Right? So this mentality and this perspective is coming out of a place of love in a lot of ways, in that they are attempting to protect not only the life of the unborn child, but they're also trying to protect the mother and her physical and mental stability. Right. Now, you can also draw on the quote, human life must be respected and protected absolutely from the moment of conception. From the first moment of his existence, a human being must be recognised as having the rights of a person, among which is the inviolable right of every innocent being to life. Okay, so this quote again can be applied to both the mother and unborn child, but it is recognising that because life starts at conception, that baby, although not necessarily out in the world yet, has just as much rights as anybody else. All right, so from a Catholic perspective, they're attempting to take in both the woman and the child and protect them both in this scenario. Now, another influencing factor for the Catholic view of abortion relates to the idea of natural law. All right, and this pretty much expresses the belief that God has set up the world in a particular way, right, and it's wrong for humans to interfere with this. So essentially what this is saying is that human beings do not have the right to interfere with the natural order of things. Okay, so in terms of abortion, you're looking at the fact that it interferes with the natural process of bringing life into the world. All right, so to simplify this, it's essentially the idea that if God did not want this baby to survive and didn't want this baby to come into the world, then God would end the pregnancy. All right, so it's not up to the human to do so. And this is where you can connect it to the quote mentioned earlier, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Now, although there are no exceptions to the Catholic perspective in terms of abortions, there is a loophole, if you will, and this refers to the doctrine of double effect. All right, now, essentially, this is the Church recognising that sometimes abortions will occur. Now, an example of this is, say a woman is extremely sick and requires an abortion. Now, doctors, as professionals and having taken the Hippocratic Oath, they're required to do everything in their power to save that woman's life. So, for example, they go in to operate on the woman in an attempt to save her life. Now, as unintended or unforeseen consequence of these actions of saving the mother, the baby is lost. All right, now, the reason that this is a loophole or accepted is because it was not the intentions of the doctor to kill the child. All right, their intention was to save the mother. All right, so if you're going to talk about the doctrine of double effect, it's really important that you recognise the difference and that it is about intention. They are intending to save the mother. Unfortunately, as a consequence of these actions, the baby is lost. This slide essentially is just another bit of information or source of ethical guidance that you could draw on in relation to the Catholic perspective, if you will. It's taken from Pope John Paul II, where he says, "I declare that direct abortion, that is, abortion willed as an ends or a means, right, so deliberate act of killing, always constitutes a grave moral disorder, since it is the deliberate killing of an innocent human being." Okay, so now that we've discussed the Catholic view on abortion as being no exceptions, but there is the loophole of doctrine of double effect, we're going to move on to the Catholic viewpoint of euthanasia, and we're looking for similarities in regards to their viewpoint. So earlier in the video, I mentioned that they also say no to euthanasia, again with no exceptions, so pretty much the exact same perspective as the one they had in abortion. And but in terms of the reasoning and the justification for this, you're looking at the idea that for Catholics, the suffering and hardship, it is through this that an individual can really experience Christ on a whole new level. Right? So you could almost make a connection there to Christ's death on the cross, and it's through this suffering that that individual can really connect with that. All right, so in terms of that, they're encouraged to sort of almost seek refuge in Christ, to place their trust in Christ and by extension in God, and almost die with dignity, and with the hope of salvation. All right, so placing trust in God and His love becomes a very important theme for the Catholic perspective on euthanasia. Okay, so in response to this idea of accepting death, in terms of the family members and the rest of the Catholic community, you're looking at it from the idea of compassion. All right, so the fact that death is a natural course of life, so there's that connection again to natural law that we spoke about in relation to abortion. So that death is happening, and there needs to be this acceptance of that, that this is the natural order of things and this is the process. And so again, faith and trust and love is placed in God throughout this journey, I suppose. So in taking lessons from Jesus and his teachings, each individual is encouraged to engage in compassion with others, right, and attempt to serve others, therefore help them along that journey and try and make it as, I suppose, painless as possible. This idea is summed up in the quote, "Man was created to serve and love God and offer creation back to him," right? Because it essentially highlights that as humans we're expected to care for creation, which includes all of humanity, no matter what their state. All right. Now, in order to reinforce this no stance on abortion, we can look at the Catechism 2276 to 79, which addresses euthanasia and says, whatever its motives and means, direct euthanasia consists of putting an end to the lives of handicapped, sick or dying persons. It is morally unacceptable. Okay, so to summarise the Catholic perspective on euthanasia, we can come back once again to the quote that it is God's prerogative to take life, not humanity's, okay? And that's directly linked to the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. All right, essentially placing trust in God's authority, that when it is time for someone to die, God will see that it happens. All right, again, a connection to natural law. Okay, so hopefully you can see a direct relation between the Catholic view on abortion to their view on euthanasia, in the sense that they say no to both with no exceptions. All right, looking at it from a perspective of God's authority, and that it's only his right to take life, in acknowledging the natural order of things, and in terms of placing trust and love in God, in an attempt to protect other people, preserve their life, which is a key belief that you could talk about. All right, so we're going to move on to the Anglican view, and I do ask that as I talk about the Anglican perspective that you attempt to make connections between their view and that of the Catholics in terms of identifying their similarities and differences. Okay, so in terms of the Anglican view on abortion, we have already discovered that they say no, they do not promote it in any way. All right, and in a similar way to Catholics, they recognise that the fetus is God-given life. Right, it has the potential to develop relationships, think, pray, choose, and love. All right, and you can relate to the quote, all human life, including life developing in the womb, is created by God in his own image and is therefore to be nurtured, supported and protected. All right, so within this we do have a connection to the key beliefs of sanctity of life, but also honouring God's image. All right, even a connection to the preservation of life, because clearly it is promoting the idea that this fetus should be is given the right to life, and humans should not get in the way of that. To extend on a connection to the Catholic view and really bring out the similarities, we have got a connection to the fact that God has a purpose to every person, all right? And this can be connected to the quote, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, all right? Essentially, this just outlines the fact that God had in mind the type of person that they would be before they were even born, all right? And in this sense, there is that connection to natural law, the natural order of things. God has a plan. It is his authority that must be respected. And that's reinforced by, once again, the quote, the Lord gave and the Lord takes away. Okay, now in saying that, so we've definitely got a lot of similarities between the Anglican and Catholic perspective. All right, and this is revealed in a quote on the screen at the moment, but this quote also allows for a pathway into an alternate sort of viewpoint in some cases. All right, so in the light of our conviction that the fetus has the right to live and develop as a member of the human family, we see abortion, the termination of that life by the act of a man, as a great moral evil. We do not believe that the right to life as pertaining to persons admits no exceptions whatever, but the right of the innocent life admits surely a few exceptions indeed. Right, so you've got the idea that abortion is not promoted, however, there's a recognition that there are some exceptions to this rule. So this is where a difference to the Catholic perspective becomes apparent. So unlike the Catholics who admit no exceptions, the Anglican Church do. The first exception to the rule is if the mother's life is in danger due to the pregnancy. All right, now in a way, this could, I suppose, suggest that the mother's life is viewed as more important, but perhaps you can just acknowledge that without the mother living, then the fetus also would be unable to live. So in situations where continuing a pregnancy would threaten the life of the mother, then a termination of the pregnancy is allowed, all right? And in this case, the mother and those involved should be supported, shown mercy and compassion. The second exception to the abortion rule from the Anglican perspective is if there is a fear of severe or serious fetal handicap, and we're talking about the severity meaning that the child is unlikely to survive long after their birth. All right. If this is seen as a fear, then the Anglican Church encourages the woman to have an abortion as soon as possible. In terms of some additional context information, you can consider the Abortion Act of 1967, where the Parliament in the United Kingdom legalised abortion by registered practitioners, and they regulated provisions for such medical practices through the National Health Service. Essentially, this act made abortion legal in the UK up to 28 weeks into the pregnancy. Now, this act was actually amended in 1990 by the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act, and the result of that was abortions could not occur after the 24-week mark. All right. If this was to happen post 24 weeks, it was only in order to save the woman, or if there was some type of severe fetal abnormality that could potentially lead to physical or mental injury to the woman. So you can see that even the exception to the 24-week rule is directly connected to the two exceptions recognised by the Anglican Church. Now, obviously, there is still the need to recognise that the Anglican Church is not going to promote abortion in any case, but because of this act, it does sort of bring in some additional situations, I suppose, into the mix and creates a larger grey area. So although the Church is always going to promote those two exceptions to the rule, and within those exceptions, they believe that compassion and understanding needs to be shown. Okay, so this is, again, a recognition that they are varying for the Catholics in the fact that they've identified some exceptions. All right, so in these cases, there needs to be support shown to the mother and also the father, because his input should also be taken into account. But with that, there's a recognition that the situation in which an abortion is wanted is often complex. All right, it cannot necessarily be sidelined, and various components need to be taken into account. In these situations, the Church should be there to help support and guide the people in these particular situations. And this can be supported by the quote, "Every possible support, especially by Church members, needs to be given to those who are pregnant in difficult circumstances." In addition, we can identify a link to the ethical teachings in attempt to support this compassionate and supportive view in these particular circumstances. And one of the key points you could make relates to the Beatitudes located in the New Testament. Blessed are the merciful, for thou shalt obtain mercy. All right, and essentially this attempts to summarize the idea that love, compassion, and forgiveness towards one neighbor will bring peace in your relationships. All right, and your heavenly Father will be merciful with you. Jesus reminds us that whatever you did to the least of my brethren, you did to me. All right, so there's this recognition that judgment should not be placed upon the people in this situation because they are all God's children. So support and love should be shown as well. You would want it back to you and you would expect from God. This is further enhanced by Jesus' commandment of love. A new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. So essentially, again, there's this idea of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but there is this underlining component or element of love that is evident in the decisions, love towards these people and support them. And in doing so, you highlight the Christian belief system. Okay, so that wrapped up our Anglican standpoint on abortion, which essentially is no, but there are some exceptions, and in these cases, support and compassion should be shown. Now, we're going to move on to the Anglican standpoint regarding euthanasia. Just as I requested when looking at the Catholic view, I want you to consider how their perspective is similar and or different, right? And by extension, considering how the Anglican perspective is similar and or different to the Catholic perspective. So let's begin. Initially, in summary, short form, whatever, the Anglican view on euthanasia is pretty much the same as Catholics, all right? They affirm that life is a gift from God and it's not to be taken, all right? So they do not in any way promote abortion, and at this stage there seems to be no exceptions. Let's take a further look. Okay, the quote, "This issue is literally life-threatening for society. It would endanger the lives of sick and vulnerable people." All right, so essentially this quote is highlighting that the option for euthanasia is not only a dangerous one for those who are terminally ill, but those family members and supporting members that are around. If we consider that a lot of people's choices to want to be euthanized are based around either wanting relief from the pain and wanting it to be over, or no longer wanting to be a burden on their family. So this quote is pretty much saying that's not a good enough excuse. We should be sort of banding together in support and in love. Now, this is supported by the idea of palliative care. Now, from an Anglican perspective, to be able to engage in euthanasia seems to devalue this process, which is concerned with alleviating pain, so that those people who are dying or are terminally ill can have some relief from that pain, so that the end of their life isn't awful and absolutely tragic and so painful. So there are alternate measures in place in order to avoid euthanasia. These measures are also evident in the hospice movement, which was founded in 1967. Essentially, the woman who founded this, Cicely Saunders, believed that the end of a person's life was just as special as any other, and that they're still capable of achieving so much during this time, even if it's purely more time with their family. So in terms of the hospice movement, you're looking to provide a holistic care of the dying, to manage their pain, provide medical care, and to support the person. But it also extends beyond this in terms of supporting their support network as well, who, as I mentioned before, is sometimes a concern of the patient because they worry that they are becoming a burden on their loved ones. The hospice movement sort of allows relief from that in a sense, because it is this almost like having your own personal nurse to help take some of the pressure off and some of the pain out of these patients. So from an Anglican standpoint, there's no need for euthanasia because palliative care and the hospice movement is in place to help. So to wrap up the Anglican perspective on abortion and euthanasia, we can see that they say no to both of them. However, with abortion, they do recognise two exceptions to the rule. The first one being the mother's life is in danger, and the second one being severe fetal handicap. So what I want you to do now, in order to consolidate your knowledge and understanding and be able to recognise the similarities and differences between variants, I want you to pause the video and just complete the table that you see in front of you, where you look at the similarities between the Catholic and Anglican stance on abortion and support that with key quotes. And then consider the differences between the Catholic and Anglican stance on abortion, and again, include key quotes. So pause this video while you complete that, please. Once you've completed the compare and contrast table on abortion, I want you to repeat this process, but this time in relation to euthanasia. So pause this video while you complete that, please. Okay, so now that you have an understanding of the Catholic and Anglican perspectives on both euthanasia and abortion, and hopefully you're a developing understanding of the similarities and differences in their approach to both of those issues, it's time to move on to our third variant, which is the Uniting Church. So we'll begin with their opinion or perspective on abortion. So like Catholics and Anglican, they do not promote abortion. Life is a gift given by God in the beginning, and all human beings are made in the image of God. All right. They also believe that human beings are called to respect the sacredness of human life. So a connection can be made to the overall Christian perspective here, and the quotes, "Thou shalt not kill, and the Lord gives and the Lord takes away," is relevant to this particular point in terms of them not promoting abortion. This said, the Uniting Church does move away from the Catholic and Anglicans in the sense that they do recognise exceptions, and they don't necessarily have a blanket yes or no response to abortion in all cases. What this means is, and I spoke about situational ethics on the previous video, they take into account the context and the situation. And in this, they call people to respond with compassion and generosity to anyone placed in this situation. Now, the Catholics and Anglicans, obviously in their perspective, show great care for the fetus, but also for the mother. And the Uniting Church does this as well. They really try to advocate the rights of the woman as well as the unborn child. All right, and in order to support this idea, you can relate to the Jesus's commandment of love. A new commandment I give you: love one another, etc., etc. I've spoken about this one. In addition to Jesus' commandment of love, you could also make a connection to the Beatitudes, which was mentioned when discussing Anglicans. So obviously you can still see some similarities here in terms of their interpretation of the ethical teachings. So the Beatitude, "Blessed are the merciful, for thou shalt obtain mercy," is also relevant to the Uniting Church standpoint. Okay, so I'm hoping here you can see the similarities between the Uniting Church and the Anglicans purely through their interpretation of the ethical teachings of Christianity. But I'm also hoping that you are starting to reveal a bit of the differences as well. Now, it is important to note that Uniting Church rejects two extremes, and these extremes are that abortion should never be available, which was heavily evident in the Catholic view, but also they reject the extreme that abortion should be regarded as simply another medical procedure. Okay, so in a similar way to Catholics and Anglican alike, abortion is never seen as the go-to process. In fact, it's probably the last pathway that they would recommend, and they get there through discussion, through support, through compassion. All right, it's sort of like the final option in a sense. So they do reject these two extremes regarding abortion. Okay, now in similar way to the Anglicans, they do recognise that abortion is accepted under some circumstances, and the most notable ones again are the mother's life are in danger, but also extreme fetal disabilities. Now these are not the only cases. I know in class people have brought up issues regarding sexual abuse and stuff like that. And this is where the Uniting Church would take each situation on its own merit and engage in discussion and sort of conversation in order to come to the best possible solution. Right, and it's for that reason that although they don't promote it, they don't actually have an official stance on it. Okay, so they don't believe that no in all cases or yes in all cases. It's really a case-by-case basis. Now, in order to help people who are going through this particular situation, the Uniting Church believe that the choice of whether or not to abort a child belongs to the pregnant woman. All right, so this connects back to the idea of them advocating the rights of the woman. Now, in these cases, they believe that there should be a focus on love and compassion rather than blame and judgment. Right? So it is the role of the church to be supportive. They are to supply spiritual, emotional, and pastoral support. And that in these situations, a woman should be able and feel comfortable to discuss her options with her church leaders and authority, and that they should be open to such discussions. Another idea worth mentioning is that synods of the Uniting Church have spoken on the matter of abortion, and in doing so have recognised that many women will often choose to abort because of a concern of social and economic hardships, essentially that they won't be able to afford to bring up a child. Now, in these type of cases, the church believes that it's not their role to condemn the decision, but to be supportive. They instead should look for solutions where they can change society and public policy so that these women get the emotional, social and economic support that is needed to raise a child. By extension, this can include adequate income and housing and proper assistance for parents who are attempting to raise a child with a disability. From this perspective, there's a recognition that society is often failing the women in this particular way, and therefore it's sort of almost pigeonholing them into wanting to abort because of this fear. So if these things in society can be changed, then you may have less people actually opting to abort the child. So to summarise the Uniting Church perspective, if a person is placed in this particular situation, they just encourage them and their partner, their family, to make these decisions very carefully, to engage in prayer and to acknowledge their continuous need for God's grace and forgiveness. Okay, so we've had a look at the Uniting Church standpoint on abortion, and hopefully recognise that while they don't promote it, there's no official stance, and believe that they should respond in compassion and generosity to those placed in those situations. So we're going to move on now to the Uniting Church standpoint on euthanasia. And again, I ask you to look for the similarities and differences in their approach to euthanasia in comparison to their approach to abortion, and by extension consider any similarities between their stance, or differences, between their stance and that of the Catholic and Anglican churches. So firstly, I guess we need to identify that in a similar way to their approach to abortion, they do not promote euthanasia. But again, they do not have an official standpoint. They do believe that there is a place for euthanasia in the case of terminal diseases, and that a person should be able to choose euthanasia as a way to end their life with dignity, and so they don't have to prolong the suffering. All right, so they do in some cases believe that a person should have the choice to end their life at a particular time. Okay, so this is not to say that they do not uphold the value of life. Of course they do, but they do also promote that the dignity of human life should also allow a person to make this decision before they are completely overcome with suffering. And in these cases, they believe that mercy should be shown to all people. Now, a lot of this comes from the fact that their basic beliefs about God is of one who forgives, who shows grace and mercy, and who loves all people. So from this perspective, they see God as someone who is willing to forgive. Okay, so in a similar way to their approach to abortion, the Uniting Church encourages its members to act morally based on the scripture, tradition, reason, experience, but they do not feel the need to punish them when they disagree with the church, right, which is obviously not that they don't promote euthanasia, right, but they recognise context, all right, and that they cannot really lay down the absolutes of right and wrong, and that ethical understanding needs to take into account the context. Right, and in relation to these, you can use the quotes that were explored in relation to abortion. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall show mercy, and the new commandment I give you, you must love one another, etc., etc. So you start to double up a little bit there, so you might want to combine some of these ideas. Okay, so that wraps up the Uniting Church perspective on euthanasia and abortion. In order for you to again consolidate your knowledge, I want you to complete the compare and contrast table that is in front of you right now. This time you are attempting to compare and contrast the Uniting Church stance on abortion to that of the Catholic and Anglican view. So I want you to look at the similarities between the Uniting Church and the Catholics, and between the Uniting Church and Anglicans, and use quotes to support, and then look at the differences between the Uniting Church to Catholics. In perspective, use key quotes, and then do the same for the Uniting Church to Anglican perspective. So pause this video now while you complete that, please. Okay, so naturally you did a bit of a compare and contrast for abortion, so it's time to do the same thing for euthanasia. So please repeat the process, this time in regards to the bioethical issue of euthanasia. So pause this video while you do that, please. Okay, so one of the biggest problems facing you guys at the moment is that you have an understanding of content, but you do not necessarily know how to use it in order to address a question. So the activities on the following slides essentially aim to help you to be able to do this. So you've been given a series of ethical dilemmas in relation to abortion and euthanasia, and for each of these dilemmas, I want you to consider how the Catholics would respond to this situation, how the Anglicans would, and how Uniting Church would. Do not forget to back up your opinions or justify them with reference to quotes and the content that has been provided. I cannot stress enough that these activities require you to sift through the content and use only the information that is relevant. Okay, please do not dump every single bit of content you've ever learned into these responses. Use only the information that's relevant. So the first activity or ethical dilemma, number one, Imogen is an 18-year-old girl who was sexually abused 3 months ago and is suffering PTSD. She has been to the doctor complaining of nausea and cramping and has found out she's pregnant. Is it ethical for Imogen to have an abortion? Pause this video now while you complete this question. Okay, ethical dilemma number two. Otis is a 12-year-old boy who has been in a terrible car crash and is on life support. He's been on life support for a week. The doctors have advised that Otis has brain damage and only has a 70% chance of recovery. His parents have been asked if they wish to turn off life support. Should they turn off Otis's life support? Please pause this video while you answer this question. Ethical dilemma number 3. Olive and Jasper are a couple. They are both 30 years old and who work voluntarily for Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. They have always taken active steps to not fall pregnant using natural contraceptive methods. Olive has just taken a pregnancy test and the doctor confirmed she was 1 month pregnant. If she has a baby, it would mean that Jasper and her would not be able to travel anymore. Is it ethical for Olive to have an abortion? Please pause this video in order to complete this activity. Ethical dilemma number 4. Harper is a 90-year-old woman who is suffering from dementia. Over the last 2 months, she has slowly deteriorated. She no longer remembers her relatives or close friends, and she is becoming aggressive and is in much pain. She had asked her daughter if she got really bad to please end her life. Should her daughter give her a lethal injection to end her life? Please pause this video while you complete this activity. Ethical dilemma number 5. Raphael is a 28-year-old woman who is pregnant with her first child. She has a hereditary condition that makes childbirth very risky. Knowing this, she still attempted to conceive. She has just had her first scan, which has revealed that her child has a 90% chance of being born with Down syndrome. As both mother and child are at risk, is it ethical for Raphael to have an abortion? Please pause this video while you complete this activity. Okay, so hopefully you have further enhanced your knowledge of the Christian ethical teachings in relation to bioethics by completing those ethical dilemma activities. You now have the opportunity to extend yourself and attempt to write an essay or extended response to the question currently located on the screen. Now, remember again, pay attention to the question, complete a question breakdown, and only use the content that is relevant to the question. Every single sentence, every paragraph that you structure should be presented in a way that clearly and explicitly addresses the requirements of the question. Question being, critically evaluate the contribution of ethical teachings to Christianity as a living religious tradition. And that wraps up our video today on bioethical issues looked at from the various perspectives of different denominations within Christianity. So I hope that you have found it helpful in terms of content knowledge and application of content to given questions. And I'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.